Good morning, everyone, and most welcome to the lecture H779. We come across some really mild temperatures here. It's +6, 7, so all the snow is gone quicker than I ever seen before, I imagine. And today we're going to continue with David Barder. Do mind, I'm very tired. I'm so excited of this new subject, but I will try to give it my very best. It's a complete new area and it's incredibly interesting. It's like discovering a new continent all by itself. And it doesn't seem that our old thinking is going to cover this. I mentioned yesterday in 777, a lucky number, that we haven't taken up the frontal lobes or the function they have. It's been a no thing before. We didn't know it had to be there. We didn't know about the function either. And the educational system have been organized accordingly by ignoring conscious control because we didn't know about it. Neither did medicine know about it, and that's one of the reasons. A scary 40,000 people in the US had their frontal lobes partly removed in order to treat them for different psychological afflictions like schizophrenia. That actually removes everything that is to be human. So it's a very, very hard treatment. It's like saying the operation was successful, but the patient died. We are no longer doing that, but we still, until now haven't understood the full extent of how important the frontal lobe is. And today's lecture is called The Frontal Cortex and Hierarchical Control of Behavior. There is a very good illustration here in a little article written by David Barder, and it looks like this. And this is called Temporal Abstraction. And here you see different cognitive factions. Wash hair, wash face, wash body, wash legs, dry off. And the first one up the scale of the hierarchical is take shower. And the end one is clean. This is much truer to what actually happens in the brain in our system than the old one that we thought it was just to think the thing and it happened. We need to actively initiate separate actions. They are separated. They are separately learned and they are different in all human beings. And they are pre-made, so to speak. They're already there. We have them in our system. So what we do instead of going out in the world, discovering it, and then plan some action, is that we have all the action ready. It's stored in us. We cannot do new action. That's almost impossible. We can relearn, but it takes a long time. But we can relearn. But what we do instead is say yes to certain action, and we also say no to other actions. Both these systems are working in parallel. And it's as important to say no to actions as saying yes. It's almost a little bit like Alatea and Thea, to give you a hint. So this is the idea of hierarchical. It's an hierarchy. And this we haven't understood, so we have removed earlier the frontal lobes and thereby removed the control. So these people cannot organize their actions, and they cannot organize their thinking either. Two things disappears there at the same time. And they're not able to tell what's missing either, because they haven't a faculty to tell them that something's wrong. You see, you don't want to have a frontal lobotomy, obviously. So all our actions that we have are already in situ. They're already in place. That goes for perception too. All our perceptions are already made in us. They are different from everyone and never the same. Of course, because we don't share the same past. Being in reality is not being present, is to choose. It's the choosing that decides whether you are in reality or not. And therefore people with a frontal lobotomy, or even people who've gone through the traditional schooling system the last 50 years, will not have a choice, because they have not trained the frontal cortex. The educational system is not organized in that way. It's actually organized in a hazardous way. It will make a jumble after you. So, put it a bit harshly, we're all frontally lobotomized, but it's not permanent. This we can actually develop. We can develop the frontal lobes. And this is a very, very hard drawing to understand, but it's a policy of abstraction. And here you can see what could be. Parent could be a higher level of abstraction. And it can sort of be the cognitive faction for a child. And it could use a soft voice to tell, keep a soft voice in the library. It's fitting since we are in the library. And they can say, do whatever you want in the playground. And here it could also be nobody. It could be the child himself. So you can see you learn from your surroundings, so to speak, but you need to learn to have a nobody here, your own hierarchical system. And we know children, of course, don't have that from the beginning, so you can tell them what to do. Do not go into the library and speak loudly. And they will not execute it. They will not stop their box speaking loudly. You speak loud, and then you can ask them, why do you speak loud? Well, you told me not to speak loud. They cannot execute it. And we haven't realized this before. We thought the child was disobedient or rebellious or something of that sort. It's nothing in that area at all. We are completely wrong. To learn the executive factor is the hardest thing. It comes much later. And it doesn't come for everyone. And we also need to train this to have a pattern in our thinking. That's also very important. If you don't have that, your thinking will be jumbled. Your thinking parts will come by themselves, and they will trigger each other. This will trigger that one, that will trigger that one, and that will trigger that one. And you can transfer that to the illustration here, and you can understand what will happen in reality outside. If you have a jumble here, you would probably wash your legs and dry off, and then you won't be clean. Or you will dry off, and then you will wash your hair, and then will you wash your face. It's going to get into the wrong order. And this very same thing happens with thinking. So school children today, since they don't learn frontal cortex, hierarchical control of behavior, they will actually jumble their thinking. So they will unlearn control. And when you unlearn control, these boxes come by themselves and they trigger themselves. And also the environment will trigger those different boxes. And if you go to a schoolyard today, or better, a classroom, you will notice that there is a chaotic relationship today. Children cannot control the behavior anymore. They start speaking by themselves, triggered by the environment, or only by seeing other students, or being in a place that excites them. So they do it instinctively, one could say, but it's not instinct. It's the lack of this very important cognitive control. And this is very good for me, because this is something I noticed when I studied at the university. I was often shocked, but there was no intelligent behavior inside the schooling room. People just trigger their thoughts like here, like there, and if thinking is not organized, it becomes shallow. It doesn't enter into the depth. And I often wondered, why is that? Why is things triggered? And often people just said things, and I realize now it was triggered by themselves. One thought triggered another thought, and then it goes on. And it sounded to rambling to me many times. It just happened. And this is very important to understand. Not understanding that we have a hierarchical system will mean, one, if it's not an explicit understanding and not an implicit understanding, you will not think. This is what you find in academia, schooling system. You find it in bureaucracy. You will find it in a varying degree in also enterprise, but not on the top. If you, however, which was often very common, you have an implicit understanding of this, but you don't have an explicit. Explicit is impossible, because then David Bardrick just came out. We didn't know about this. You do think, but you don't do that consciously. And you will not improve. You will have some sort of hierarchical control, but you will not improve. That could be people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Nadal, or Winston Churchill. I took a historical person. Winston Churchill is very obvious that he uses conscious control. And one of the reasons we can know that is he did say things that no one else said. He was one of the few people in the British Parliament that said that Germany needs to be defeated already in the 30s. And that could not be triggered by some outside stimuli. No one else said it, so it was not triggered, and it had to be triggered from some sort of hierarchy. He was actually thinking, and he somewhere realized that Germany was a threat, and he didn't care about the stimuli coming from outside, and to a certain extent he ignored inside stimuli. So instead he left this decide what he did and said. He was the only person that shouted in the parliament, and I like that. It's too bad it was not recorded, but he shouted, "Germany must be defeated," and everybody thought him to be a warmonger. He was not. He had actually understood to the fullest what Germany was. Later, of course, everyone understood that, but then it's not caused by the hierarchical control, it's caused by the environment, and that's very different. That's not thinking. This is what I mean by thinking. It's still good, of course, that everybody thinks the same about Germany in that case. It's practical, but it's not thinking. So you hear nothing less than a redefinition of what thinking is. which is in itself very interesting, and it should actually be made into a lecture of its own. We'll have to wait for that a whole week almost. Yeah, that's amazing. We need to redefine thinking. We are very sloppy when it comes to the definition of thinking. We think everybody thinks, but it's just the environment. And I mentioned that yesterday. We have today a very advanced environment. We have loads of things that are already organized. So you can say we have an environment that triggers different things. And instead of this cumbersome illustration with a shower, I'll show it one last time, where you have to think for yourself in each action. Me going into a room today, it's very simple. I just have to hit the light switch. I do it automatically. The room is already warm. I don't have to do anything. You can compare that how it used to be. Then you need to light the candle. You need to make the warm room. You see, our environment is sort of simplified in a way. The stimuli makes the action. My action comes from the outside. Somebody at some instance had been doing the thinking, but I am not doing it. I just receive stimuli from the outside. And from a certain perspective, that could look all right. Well, and in our regular measurement, how is the society working? Are there any problems with lights in the houses, in the rooms? Can we see what is written? No, we cannot. But there is another problem. We don't think. And that is actually a problem in itself. Because it means not only I cannot regulate my own behavior, I don't train my own regulating of the behavior. And thirdly, and this is an interesting problem that comes up in this article, if you don't control, the more you don't control, the more and more these individual pieces are going to initiate themselves. They're going to stimulate themselves because there's nobody to tell them what to do. And this is very similar to having a kennel that's a load of dogs. And you don't tell them when to behave and when to play. This is what you do in a kennel. You want dogs that are healthy, happy and playful, but you also need them to be disciplined, not to bark at people passing by or even biting each other. Such things you need to discipline. You can think of these like dogs with no supervision, where the owner has gone for a vacation for a couple of months and leave the dogs in the kennel. They are going to start misbehave, and they will trigger each other by themselves. They don't need a hierarchical stimulation, because these things can trigger themselves. But there's no organization, there's no intention. So you will get chaos. This is what happened to thinking today. Thinking is not organized. So when I think something, that could trigger some other thought, and it would become like my shower example. I will wash my hair, I will dry myself, and then I have to go into the shower again. The same happened to the thinking. I will start in the wrong end. Maybe before I gather information, I start doing the analysis, and before I put the position of being critical, I'm being too affirmative, because intellectual thinking needs to be done in a specific order as well. First you gather information, then you assess them, then you analyze them, and fourth or fifth, then you criticize. But I noticed much in academic criticism come directly, which is wrong. First you need to understand what it's about. and then you need to take it to your heart. And then you can analyze, and then come criticism. And you can imagine what happens when they get jumbled up, and this starts already in school today, probably even in preschool. How could that be? Well, as you saw in this second picture, if you don't have a person, here is a parent, but could also be a kindergarten leader, if that person does not in himself or herself have hierarchical cognitive control, the ones under won't have either. The control must come from some, how do you say, förebild? How do you say that in English?
To be an example. To be next.
Some sort of idol or some imitation person. If you don't have that, that person in itself doesn't have cognitive control. The children won't have it either, so they won't develop it. It's nothing different from you need to be a person who speaks Swedish if you want to learn Swedish, English, French, or something like that. And you need to see somebody who eats properly to learn to eat properly. It's the same thing. It's a learned in behavior. And it could actually be civilized behavior, so it's not present in uncivilized people. I would say it is to some degree. But the more complicated the societies, the more we need hierarchical control, because there's so many factors that's already arranged around us. So losing grip is much easier in this complicated safe haven. And that's a problem we have ignored because we didn't know about it. So what will happen to these children? Yeah, everything becomes jumbled up. And I'd say this is called ADHD, for instance, because that's the lack of controlling your thinking process. And it's actually, and this is very good, that's actually visible in how they move. They don't move in the same way. All ADHD patients are not patients, but sufferers. They move in a very similar manner. It's not in the right order. So it can actually be diagnosed by an interview, it can be diagnosed by test, but also by observing carefully. They do similar things, similar wrong things. So this could be an explanation for loads of other things as well. Because what happens in the end, some of these cognitive functions are more dominant than others. They have a greater tendency to be triggered. And what could those be? Well, obviously, those are the ones that trigger danger. And one of these cognitive functions that trigger danger can ignite loads of different thinking factions. And this is what I would say another thing that is very common today, and it's called generalized anxiety syndrome. And that's your thoughts, your thinking process is igniting itself, goes by itself. And once this does not exist to any higher degree, that will be happening automatically to them, because we have so many trigger factors around us as well. Take a simple newspaper. They thrive on igniting one or two or three of the cognitive factions by signaling, giving a red light or a red flag, danger. They're signaling danger. And the person that buys the newspaper, and sometimes the danger is very, very diminutive. But 90% of the headlines today are negative, just because of this reason. Danger, we are sort of constructed to react extra much for danger. This becomes habituated. In the end, you saw a custom, this one is taking over the role as a leader, you could say, and it will trigger and trigger and trigger, and that will go on all day. And now it's very common among young people already from the ages of 7, 8, 9 to have a Vorian complex. And in the end that will develop to different one of these acronyms. GAD is one, panic anxiety is another one, generalized anxiety is the third one. That is very common, and that will exhaust the system and also lead to depression. Depression has risen sky high because the system gets exhausted by this. It takes a lot of energy and you will not be able to perform your action. And if you cannot perform your action, your thinking action, or your actual visible action from the outside, you will not be able to reach your goals. Let me put this into context of today here. I was thinking today that when you take something, we are trying out something now with a slow movement, and I've been looking into earlier, maybe a year ago, different systems for slowing down thought and thinking from the East. And in the translation, and not necessarily a problem with translation, but it is a problem in the transfer from a culture where this is recognized and trained actively. It's also, they have different terms. For instance, in India, this is usually called the body. They know about it. It's spelled this way, not to be confused with body with a Y. Something gets confused. We don't have that system, and we have this term in Ashtanga. It's called what is it called now? It means control of the mind, and that precedes pranayama, which is respiration control. It will come to my mind soon here. It's gone. This is my tiredness here. But that is usually interpreted in the West, stop thinking. It's a very simplified, crude idea of what you're supposed to do. You cannot stop thinking, and what would be the point of stopping thinking? If you take this system, what even would it mean? You need these different pieces to do things. So that's a horrible translation, but it's also a different culture basis that actually causes this. Instead, I think a more accurate idea of this is thinking of the dogs I mentioned earlier. You want the dogs to be happy and joyful. That is creative, good thinking, but you also need discipline. So what you should do is have a little time where you have some sort of discipline, where you create this, but you also want these to be energized and free. And you do that first one time period, you discipline them, and then you let them be free. And you discipline them and let them be free. You do exactly the same thing with the dog. Yes, I'm comparing thinking to dogs here. It's very apt, actually. For instance, if you tell a dog to retrieve something, I used to borrow a retriever, and he was very good at retrieving. You tell the dog, you can throw something away, and you say to the dog, retrieve that. That's the discipline. And after the dog retrieve the thing you want, you give it a reward. And you also let it be free. It needs its freedom for 10-15 seconds after you give it the second one. Because you want to have a happy dog. If you try to make the dog do it all the time, and I actually did that because when I was young I didn't know better, I was very young. And I forced not a retriever, but it was a similar dog, to do the things all the time because I liked it. I was a kid. In the end, the dog got fed up and started barking and disappeared. That's not a happy dog. We need happy thinking. And to enforce hierarchical control, that's a flexible, lenient, accommodating action. It can't be forced on because you don't want force. And usually this discipline system from India, China, Japan often get interpreted on some sort of disciplining that doesn't have this leniency. And I think that's one of the reasons none of these functions never worked. And if you train Ashtanga, this thing is never mentioned. It's called Devangari, I will remember now. It's never mentioned because who would like to do such a thing? You should, and it's very helpful once you understand what you're supposed to do. And not something that is completely impossible. So what I'm implying here, motivation is almost like the same thing as cognitive control. You need to have sort of a friendly attitude to the different cognitive factions and let them go. In the shower example, you can't tell the other ones, just go into the shower, take cold water or warm water into your face and do this and do that. You need to be sensitive, just as you have a dog system. This must sounds, whoa, we don't have any control over our thinking system. No, we don't. Why should we? Why should the thinking system be built on control? It's not. But what we can do, we can build the control of partly or completely independent factors. That's seem to be. And the reason being why they have to be independent, because the world is different. The world is not the same. Our actions are never the same. And I think the old system thought every action is in some way the same, and we just call them action. Hey, all action are very, very different. Just by using the term action is deceiving. All action is different because it's a different world we live in. And once again, we have this monosemism popping up, and here you have probably Kalle a neurological explanation for monosemism. And that's the idea that all action is the same. It's not. All action is completely different. They are not the same in any way, because the world is different. And that means thinking in a way, to get a little philosophical at the end of the lecture. Thinking is in itself not only indefinite, it's also infinite. It doesn't have any limitation to it. And that's quite something to be thought of. And I think most people today, sitting in the schooling system, sitting in academia, they think the world is just the opposite, more or less finished already. I heard somebody say, I don't want to do inventions. All the inventions are already made. And we have that example with Planck as well. Planck was one of the founders of quantum physics, enormous genius. But he was actually advised by his own professor, don't go into physics in the 1910s somewhere, because physics is a dumb area. A horrible advice to give. And what did that come from? It came from monosemism. It came from not understanding the workings of the world, nor the mind/brain. It's a horrible thinking. It's a really lousy thinking. And I mean, lousy, it's not bad it's not a bad comment. It's bad. He was a bad thinker, that professor. But today, this is extremely common, because thinking the world is finished, ready, is the same as not having a control. Because if you don't have any control, all your stimuli for action will come from outside or by itself. And then the world is finished for you, because you don't have any will. And it's a little bit like giving into determinism in a very, very real way. You are literally a lobotomized robot. And that's rather horrible. But remember the stories I told in 777, that people didn't even notice when this poor lady, Mrs. Primrose, had her whole frontal lobe removed. Her whole. And nobody noticed. But she was gone. She wasn't a human being anymore. She was completely gone and people didn't even notice. So, of course, we don't notice this either. This is why this exploration and discovery of David Barter and more people, it's not alone, is incredibly important and incredibly telling that we ignored maybe the most important area in what it is to be a human being. Can you imagine? She was gone and they didn't even notice that. What she was normal, and the tester her intellectual qualities, and they said she's normal. I think that rounds about sums the whole thing up rather well, and I say thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a really pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Excellent.